Hi, everybody, and welcome back to OMN INSIGHT. My name is Sariti Kadir. I'm your host, and today we are going to be having a conversation about the relationship between climate change and the current drought conditions we are seeing across Oromia and the wider Horn region. And additionally, we're going to be exploring the role that science and innovation can have in helping us not just mitigate the immediate crisis, but also develop preventative measures as the climate crisis continues to develop. To have this conversation, I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Sheila Ochugboju, who is the Executive Director of Alliance for Science, as well as an international development expert and communications specialist who has been working in research science and international development for more than 15 years. And I also have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Tadesse Daba, the director at the Agricultural Technology Research Directorate at the Ethiopian Institute of Agricultural Research. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
So the first question is for you, Dr. Ochugboju. There seems to be this global tug of war between the global science community and the global political community, where many governments claim that climate change is a natural phenomenon that either can't be mitigated or that it isn't a real phenomenon at all. And the global science community urging us to act to curb climate change now or face irreversible global catastrophe. The drought that has been evolving in the south of Oromia and that is also impacting eastern regions of the country, as well as northern Kenya and other parts of the Horn region, has reached a critical point. In what way, Dr. Ochugboju, is climate change a cause for this crisis? And why are governments refusing to acknowledge the climate crisis when the stakes are so high?
Hello, thank you so much for having me on this really important conversation, and especially very important for Ethiopia and important for the region, Africa. Yes, we've been talking about climate change for decades now, but I do feel that the moment where we think about we're still disputing the science is really gone. I don't feel that there is dispute about the science. There is generally a consensus within the scientific community that climate change is real, that we, in terms of our way of living, our industrialized society, have caused emissions that are having an impact on our climate. And those impacts are being felt all around the world with increased extreme weather conditions, droughts, floods, and just extreme variability, which is making it very hard for farmers and especially smallholder farmers to plant. The cost of the climate change crisis for Africa is extreme because we have actually emitted the least, and yet we're suffering the worst in terms of impact. The cost for Africa is estimated will be about $50 billion per year by 2050. And this is an estimate by a UN Environment Program and also accepted by the Africa Development Bank. We're going to need as a continent about 3 trillion in investments on adaptation and mitigation to even keep us within a normal range in terms of productivity and livelihoods. That's business as usual model. In terms of for us to carry on the way we are, we would need this sort of investments just to stay on an even keel. And of course, as African countries, we don't have it. So we need to, as a scientific community, begin to think about deploying some of the innovations that we've actually, as science community, been working on for decades. Hybrid varieties that are drought tolerant, that are pest tolerant, that are able to work on poor soils. So in every African country, we have incredible researchers such as Dr. Abba, who is coming on now, who have been working on these technologies for decades. The problem has been uptake. It has also been a politicization of the conversation about agricultural biotechnology, climate change. Politics is involved in everything, in every decision we make. There are political dimensions that somehow, sometimes shift the science to another side. but the innovations are there. And what we're working at the Alliance for Science with the Open Forum for Agricultural Biotechnology in Africa is to get communities, decision makers, farmers to understand the climate smart solutions that are there and to begin to deploy them as soon as possible, because we really have no more time.
You mentioned that there is this politicization and issues around uptake of this science and innovation. From your engagement with the African political community, at the level of heads of state or governments, is there generally an acceptance that the climate crisis must be addressed, or is there still a resistance to this discourse? And if there is, why do you think that's there?
I don't feel that there's a resistance, because Africa as a bloc and developing countries as a group have been going to the climate talks each year, COP27, which we just came back from, have been as a bloc asking for more investments in terms of adaptation, saying how difficult it is for us to adapt to climate change. So I think we've moved from, is climate change real? Do we have to do something about it? To a conversation about how much would it take for us to have effective solutions? And where's that investment going to come from? And really the investment should come from the emitters, the countries that have industrialized when we didn't know so much about climate change and have benefited from rapid industrialization. And we're just beginning to industrialize but now in light of climate change are having our innovations somewhat capped, because we have to be smarter about how we industrialize. So African countries and the global South in general has been asking for support to adapt, and has actually been asking for the global community to invest in technologies for that adaptation to be real, and have actually been on board, have done the national determined contributions, have done adaptation plans, have been following the consensus path, but have not seen the trickle down of the investments and have not seen the change in impact, and instead are seeing increased loss and damage every year. So it's always political, but we are here to say science has solutions that we can deploy and add into the mix. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Ochugboju. Following up from this question, coming to you, Dr. Daba, to what extent is the Ethiopian government acknowledging the climate crisis as one of the main reasons for the drought and famine? And are there any existing drought coping mechanisms that the Ethiopian government is looking at putting in place, or that are in place, that recognize that climate change is an urgent issue in this crisis?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think climate change is a natural issue, and is not something that somebody denies or accepts. And because of this, for example, drought is one of the effects of climate cycle, which can happen anywhere in the world. And even according to WHO report, for example, about 55 million people can be affected every year because of this climate change and the drought, and 41% of the world population may face critical water scarcity because of the climate change. And this climate change effect is everywhere and can happen elsewhere because of the increase in the rise of global temperature. Drier places become more drier, which is called El Nino, and most of wet places become more wetter. And that is why we see typhoons and the cyclones everywhere, like in Philippines and Bangladesh and so forth, and the drought mostly in sub-Saharan African countries. And so climate change is something global and natural that we cannot deny at all. And that's what happened in Ethiopia as well. And currently, it has been beyond the prevention. I mean, it's now at the catastrophic stage, and the most strategic thing we can do now is saving the life of people and the livestock in the area affected by severe drought. It is thought to be shortage of rain for the last consecutive 4 to 5 years in Borana areas, southern part of Ethiopia now. even I think is lowland of Bale and RC are being affected by this drought. So coping mechanisms, yes, there were techniques like now as emergency aid, there are companies and foreign aid agencies like Catholic Relief Service, Mention for Mention, some are helping, and even government is mobilizing government institutes and population in the country to donate and save the life of human and the livestock in the area. This is an emergency issue, but in the future, there should be underground water development, watershed, integrated watershed rehabilitation projects, and long-lasting projects should be devised. And I think there has been starting the attempts, which were not so effective so far, and that is why this catastrophic stage of drought has happened. And I can say we were not prepared to the level of the effect of drought that has happened in Borana.
Mm-hmm. So just coming off that last remark that you made there, Dr. Daba, in terms of these mitigation strategies and coping mechanisms that have been you've tried to implement, or the government has tried to implement, and them not being very effective, is this because there's been a lack of investment in terms of resource from the government, and then broadly the international community investing in the government to be able to implement these strategies? Or is there some resistance at a local community level to trial new methods of developing their livelihoods in terms of as farmers and pastoralists? What was the cause of that ineffectiveness in your view?
Honestly speaking, I'm from research and not from the development, and I have little information about these development projects in those areas. But I have an information like there was a Borana Water Network project which has started before a couple of years, and it went some level and was not completed so far. It is a kind of large-scale underground water reservoir collection mechanism that will be used for the human and the livestock, then even for irrigation in Boran. And I think they went somewhere, somehow, but it was not completed for so many years, and I don't know the reason. And again, there were many NGOs working in those areas, and I couldn't see the development of wells and dependable underground water development strategies so far. And recently I heard from media, I don't remember which it is, but there was a strategy of saving certain to the 10% of Boran cattle population. I don't know if it is in ranch or in some mechanism. So they took the elite kind of animals and saving somewhere and managing independently to save the genetic resource of the Boran livestock.
Thank you for that response, Dr. Daba. Coming to kind of the second part of our conversation, I'll come back to you, Dr. Ochugboju. The institute that you currently lead, Alliance for Science, advocates that science and innovation play a crucial role in alleviating poverty in the global south. And in particular, you confront what you define as misinformation about technology like GMOs and gene editing. Why is there fear and uncertainty about the role that science plays, or this particular kind of science plays, in poverty alleviation? And how do you see those fears expressed in perhaps government policy or public discourse? And what is at stake, in your opinion, again, if we don't move beyond these fears?
Wow, thank you very much for that really important question. Yes, we do confront misinformation. We have to recognize that we as humanity have never had access to so much information in the history of humanity. We have information that comes to us from so many different sources. We have very few filters and abilities to filter out global information. Before we had a few trusted sources and we had very localized ways. We had time to process. Now we don't. So It's important for those of us trying to create an enabling environment for science and technology uptake to also address head-on the challenges of misinformation. And misinformation, I guess at some level, is a natural instinct. We fear what we don't know. We don't trust what we haven't seen before. We've seen it with the uptake of all technologies, from the motor car to television to microwaves. Every technology as it came, communities had to, their first instinct was to step back, resist, and then take time to say, how can this help me? And then very quickly moved on. So, but the problem is we now have to do that faster and faster. And with climate change and its impacts accelerating, the innovations that we need to deploy have to be much more agile. And we as communities have to be much more prepared to make decisions that require a core basis of understanding of science and technology. So what we do is we challenge misinformation, we track it, we map it, we publish lots of reports. We recently published one about misinformation in Kenya. And that was really important because we found out that misinformation around specifically genetically modified organisms in Kenya is around 40% in terms of the news sources. 40% of the articles published had misinformation. This is really high. It's higher than normal. You would expect around 5 to 9% in any country of misinformation. That's kind of a normal level. So 40% is high. And it's particularly concerning in a country like Kenya that, like Ethiopia, is in the middle of a severe drought, worst drought in 40 years. Around 6 million people on the brink of famine, real livelihood impacts that we're just feeling. So the misinformation about GMO is really important to deal with now because we're coming up to planting season. And if farmers do not begin to use improved varieties, begin to look at drought-tolerant varieties or just hybrid varieties that can give them higher yields, the crop will fail this year, and the impact of that will be catastrophic. People are actually dying. So the work that we're doing is, first of all, to let people understand that there's a backdrop of misinformation that has to be dealt with. And then secondly, to begin to say, what can we do about it? Where can we find trusted sources? And how can we engage the media to be the trusted source, to be filters of that information? And thankfully in Kenya, the media have been great. They have largely said, the problem is we can't get the scientists to engage with us. They don't want to talk about, they don't want to come on TV. So it's really wonderful that Dr. Daba comes. There are very few scientists that will just give up their Saturday morning to come and share what they know in a way that can help communities understand their challenges and what they can do. So it's really important. We also engage, of course, with policymakers and decision makers. So Kenya is facing a huge uprise in misinformation because the government lifted a ban on genetically modified organisms. And the government did that because they were aware of the forthcoming drought and wanted a faster uptake of drought-tolerant maize, which is a staple crop. And this technology has been in the country for more than 10 years. The biosafety agencies and the regulatory agencies have passed it. So it's passed all its regulatory and policy hurdles. But it was now about public perception. So when the ban was lifted, the rise of misinformation, the huge backlash caused court cases to be brought against the government and an injunction to stop the importation and also to stop planting. This is very serious. So we as Alliance for Science are trying to open up the space for dialogue and conversation. We understand fears are real and they are valid in that when you have a fear, you should get answers. And so we're trying to engage more scientists to come into the public space and policymakers to address what these fears are so that we do not cause more lives to be put at risk because of misinformation.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive response, Dr. Ochugboju. I think you really described the stakes with the level of urgency in describing what the costs could be if farmers are not able to use these adaptation innovations in terms of seeds coming on the next planting season. Coming back to you, Dr. Daba, from the research that you have conducted or that you're engaging at the moment in your capacity as a director in the Agricultural Technology Research Directorate at the Ethiopian Institute of Agricultural Research, if you had the opportunity to stress any of the findings or any of the approaches that you and your fellow community of scientists are talking about that could be implemented in Oromia and across the rest of the country, or perhaps even the whole Horn region, to act as preventative measures in this increasingly alarming global condition of climate change, what would those findings or those approaches be that you would stress?
Thank you very much for this nice question. And first of all, I'm not the director now. I'm a lead researcher in agricultural biotech. I used to be the director for biotech in Ethiopian Institute of Agricultural Research. Yeah, to begin with the concepts you have been discussing before, technology resistance comes because of two main reasons. And one is fear of the unknown, and the other, the one we are combating with, is deliberate misinformation spreading. And it is not only in Kenya nowadays, it is massively increasing in Ethiopia as well. And genetic modification is one part of biotechnology. However, there are many technological interventions that can be used to solve the agricultural challenges. Even people still are complaining of the use of commercial fertilizer. Without which farmers, sub-Saharan, even the world farmers cannot survive. And every technology has a challenge, and we have to inform and provide scientific evidence-based knowledge and information to the users, not to the deliberately misinforming part of the elite public, but mainly to the users for the use of the country and the general public. So saying this, to combat the drought problem happening in eastern part of Africa, including Ethiopia nowadays, there are conventional technologies that we can make use of. Like, for example, there was an early warning system in those areas, and which has predicted severe drought to happen in eastern part of Africa 5 years ago. And we should have been prepared in that scale to prevent this damage, and by doing and adapting drought tolerant forage species, like making convenient environmental conditions for very productive and drought tolerant forage species, and again proper rangeland management, and also adaptive crop species. Like, for example, cassava, the importance of cassava in sub-Saharan Africa, where water stress is very serious. And I think the use of this cassava is very good starch source, and which can maintain the life of those pastoralists. And I think there are a lot of things that we can do conventionally, even before biotech. So genetic modification and the recent advancements in biotech, like genetic engineering, can do a lot potentially. Like, for example, in pastoralists, those kind of herd management is not acceptable for the futurity of and the continuity of those potential use of boran breeds. Like in that pastoralist management, there is huge inbreeding that reduces the threats. Boran livestock are very known and moderate for milk and the meat threats. And if we continue herding in that mechanism, there will be inbreeding and the deterioration of those traits. And we don't encourage, of course. But that is a long practice that has been there for many, many years and decades. and we gradually have to improve using science. Like, you know, the good hope in biotech is very, I mean, promising to save the elite born animals using assisted reproductive biotechnology, for example, by selecting the elite ones that were saved, then elite cows and even the bulls. Then we use multiple ovulation technology. Then we can even use embryo transfer technology so that we can breed many livestock or boran breeds which were affected because of drought. The other thing is we can improve the disease resistance of these animals, which are prone, like as they are living in the lowlands, and there are a series of diseases like thrips. Biotechnology can play a very great role, like developing multi monoclonal antibodies that can resist. This can be taken from any other breeds, or any trait of those boran breeds and affected areas can be improved using biotechnology. And as well, from forage, using genetic modification, even there is a possibility of transferring genes from very adaptive and resistant kind of crops or bushes, we can say, in the transfer to forage species, so that it can resist the drought and the water scarcity in those drought-prone areas. So generally, I can say biotech is very good hope that can sustain and improve or replenish the devastated livestock genetic resource in Boran area.
Thank you so much for that very detailed and resourceful answer, Dr. Daba. So much fascinatingly new information that I'm consuming and hearing you detail all of that. And it also is quite inspiring to hear that via science and innovation, there could be some real practical solutions implemented at local levels that will save lives and will empower communities. I also want to highlight the point that you made, whereby 5 years ago, there was via, again, the resources provided through science, information about an upcoming drought that could have been used for us to be able to prepare for what we are experiencing now and perhaps even mitigate this crisis. And which brings me to my last question, and this is for the both of you, but we'll start with you, Dr. Ochugboju. As bad as the climate crisis is now, it's most likely going to get worse if it's not urgently addressed. How best can governments, the science community, and the international humanitarian or NGO community work together to strategically address with preventative measures the issue of drought and famine in general, but also if you want and can apply this also to specifically in Ethiopia and Kenya?
Yes, no, thank you for that question, because it really is almost like the holy grail in terms of solutions around crisis management. And we're beginning to see a much more integrated responses, because we were working in silos before. Humanitarian community was doing its thing, science community doing its thing, policymakers doing what they do, farming communities, and each coming up at different stages with different crises. But climate change, in a way, much as it's a terrible tragedy, has been a place in terms of an issue that has brought everybody together. We all are suffering from the impacts of climate change. It is a live issue in every community. So countries like Kenya have begun, and I think also across the region, have begun to say, how can we have integrated solutions? So an example is, you have a farmer living in a particular region. You have data which tells you the soil type, the climate condition of that smallholder farmer, how big their farm is, what crops they grow. That data, we generally know, it's held somewhere in national government. Now, you know there's a forthcoming drought. You know there's a crisis. You have, in some countries, weather-based insurance or weather-based livestock insurance. Some of those initiatives have been piloted. And so the question is, how can you very quickly, using the data that you have in terms of a forthcoming drought, in terms of knowing where the farmer is, what their issue is, and perhaps knowing for sure their crops are going to fail. How can you then very quickly have a humanitarian response? In Kenya, they're trialing doing that as fast as possible through mobile payments. So if you have a data system that is integrated with an insurance system that is integrated with a weather-based system, you can say there is going to be a crisis in the Rift Valley. This many farmers are going to be affected. They need support now. And the insurance fact is triggered by the data from the weather. The farmer doesn't have to go through any complicated claims process. So then you can give humanitarian aid really targeted, quickly, at a specific time. So some of those are being trialed, and I've seen some of the prototypes of those sorts of joined up thinking and innovation. I'm hopeful that they will be deployed by next year, so that the different communities can begin to really alleviate stresses as fast as possible. And then you can then incentivize better behavior, or not better behavior, you can incentivize shifts towards adaptation. And so you can incentivize a shift towards using a hybrid seed, because you know that this soil type and the weather condition, you can incentivize payments to the farmer to use a better seed. You say, well, if you use a better seed, then you're more likely to get more support going forward. So we can, and they can make choices that are incentivized by science. So that sort of joined up thinking is beginning. And more of that has to be done. Our job at Alliance for Science is to amplify good practice, highlight it, and to perhaps shine a light on where the gaps are. And that's what we do going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ochugboju. Come in on this question, Dr. Daba, and give us your thoughts.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, as we said, climate is a broader issue. That is not, that cannot be controlled by a given country or a specific region in a continent. For example, the cause of this climate change is obviously the greenhouse gas emissions and human manipulation in any way. So, but the effect happens at specific places, like, for example, in East Africa, the crisis we are facing is because of the contribution of industrialized countries. And also we have some contributions like deforestation and the land degradation because of many issues. We have a minimum contribution, but majorly international and the regional contribution to climate change has brought this effect that we are suffering from. So the international community should think of sustainable supports, like, this, once it happens, they have to consider this issue is an international issue, it's not a local issue, because as I said, climate, the effect is international. So the support has to be there, and they should do the best possible in saving the life of human beings and the livestock in those pastoralist areas. And but what I expect from governments and international communities is to mainly focus not on life-saving kind of aids, but sustainable development kind of strategies. For example, underground water resource development and watershed development, irrigation facilities, and engaging those areas in sustainably supporting technologies, like I said, like development of forage species and very adaptive crop types, and those kind of things should be there and supported by regional and international communities. And this emergency aid kind of thing is very good, it's mandatory, but what governments and international community should focus on is not on those kind of supports. And the long term and the sustainable kind of development strategies should be there for effectively addressing this recurrent kind of climate effects. It may not be drought, of course. Sometimes there may be typhoons, cyclones, and the flooding elsewhere in any part of Africa. So we have to be proactive and get prepared for those kind of disasters.
Thank you so much for that response, Dr. Daba. And thank you both, Dr. Ochugboju and Dr. Daba, for making the time to join us for this really insightful and significant conversation today.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, I hope that you found that conversation as interesting, fascinating, and resourceful as I did. I really think that there are so many important points that can be drawn from what both Dr. Ochugboju and Dr. Daba shared. And most importantly, I think those points, if really people with the resources and the decision-making power to act in the context of policy making and sustainable development, project design, could draw a lot from the information that both of our guests shared here today. You are watching OMN Insights. My name is Sariti Kadia. I'm your host, and I look forward to seeing you next time.